G'day and welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We're so glad that you would join us today. And today we are joined by author Andrew Hamilton. Andrew has written a book called The Future is Bi Vocational. Andrew, it's so wonderful to have you on the podcast today as we talk about a whole range of things, particularly focusing upon Bi Vocational Ministry today as well.
Great to be with you, Charlie. Looking forward to it, mate.
So good. Well, hey, you've been a friend of Exponential. You were a workshop speaker at our inaugural national conference in 2023, which we were delighted to have you. But for those who maybe haven't heard your name before, give us a bit of a snapshot of where you reside, your ministry journey to date, maybe a bit about your family and just some recent updates about your life.
Yeah, sure. So I'm 60 now, which feels kind of crazy. So we've been in ministry for probably 30 odd years, as long as we've been married, 34 years. We've planted a couple of churches and most recently finished up, we were at Queen's Baptist Church in the northern suburbs of Perth, and we planted Yanchep Church out of that, and then we handed them both over to a couple of younger guys. And our intention was to be free to be able to serve some of our country churches. And I have a caravan weighing business, which, is mobile. I'll take it around so we can go to country churches and be part of that. The thing that sort of changed all that was back in March, our son died, as you know. And we went from being empty nesters, absolutely free and easy, to being in this crazy state of grief and going. We were signed up to go to Margaret River Baptist for 6 months and help them out, but we had to cancel that and just kind of allow ourselves a bit of time to work through Sam's death, which is not something you expect. But, we have these great plans and then things happen and they don't always turn out as we think they will.
That's huge, Andrew. And just to kind of pause and acknowledge that, and I guess this wasn't the major focus or intent of this particular podcast today, but obviously as a leader, we all experience obviously deep suffering, trials of life. You guys have experienced probably the most difficult season that any parent could ever possibly consider experiencing. And I just wonder, even before we kind of get to the thrust of our podcast today, if you just kind of share as much as you would like to, particularly around the trials of kind of leadership and, ministry, and let alone when something like that comes and absolutely takes you out and hits you for six. How's that been over the last couple of months for you?
Well, look, it was interesting. The week before Sam died, I've been having this conversation with his partner about the essentials of our Christian convictions, the things that really mattered, because both him and his partner were kind of doing a bit of deconstructing. And my concern was that sometimes you can pull the walls off and find there's no foundation. So I just want to have this conversation and work out what is really there that matters. And the week before Sam died, I wrote this blog post about my convictions. Number one, God is good. Jesus is Lord. Our hope is in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the day he died, look, as crazy, wild, devastating as that was, I went, you know what? God is still good. Jesus is still Lord. Our hope is very much in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that sort of stuff actually really sustained us. We've been, both my wife and I are okay. We're not losing the plot. We're not freaking out. We're just going, wow, this is the worst thing we could ever imagine. Yeah. Our daughter's finding it harder because her faith's a bit younger. That song, The Goodness of God, how we sing about, all my life I've known the goodness of God. When you're 60, you sing that like, it comes from in here. For her, she's young. And for both of us, there's been this sense of God is with us in this, as horrible as this is, and we don't look to God and go, hey, well, why did you do this? He died in a freediving accident and he was 21 and invincible. Obviously not him. Yeah. But look, it's been a really, really rough 6 months, but we haven't been, the church has been amazing. The church has been amazing. We've been carried, so it's been really good in that sense.
Well, Andrew, I'm so touched by your sharing, and thank you for the way that you're, I guess, just being faithful to Jesus in this season. That must be so difficult, so challenging, but your words are deeply touching for anyone, but particularly for any parent and any leader out there who's walking through a tough time. And as paradoxical as it is, I would just hope that they would encourage folk that might be listening today who either have gone through something like that, are going through something like that, even whatever it might be, any level of suffering, and clinging to those promises that you've just talked about.
Yeah,
That's a huge source of
absolutely.
encouragement. Now, like I said, that wasn't necessarily where we were going to focus today, but we can't not acknowledge what you've
It's
been through. That's
context.
huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And so, we wanted to talk today about, you've written a book called The Future is Bivocational. And I guess I really want to just on a overview level kind of dive into that, and then maybe, dive into some deeper stuff as we go on. But for those who are hearing that idea for the first time, what is bivocational? Where does it come from for you? Give us a bit of an insight to what you mean by the future is bivocational.
Yeah, sure. Look, there's two words we could use: bivocational or co-vocational. I think co-vocational is a better word. So you have two roles running alongside each other, but people don't use it as much. So I use bivocational in the title. So what it means is essentially a lot of pastors, churches, generally it happens like this: churches can't afford to get them full time, so they need to find a job. And I remember at 27, my first year of pastoring, reading one of our Baptist newsletters about this poor guy who had to drive the school bus down in Margaret River while he was employed a couple of days a week by his church. And I thought, oh, I'm so sad for you that your church can't afford you full time. I look back at that now and I go, in fact, I heard the story of another pastor who was doing this. People were singing his praises, saying what an amazing guy he was. He knew all their kids. He had birthday occasions for their kids when they had birthdays on the bus. There are opportunities to engage with the community that, your full-time pastor often doesn't have, or often doesn't seem to have time. So, yeah, I discovered bivocational work by accident, I guess I'd say. I used to be a phys ed teacher, started out as a youth pastor, and I did my church can't afford me full-time, I'll just do my other job thing. But I think it was 2005, we started a small business in irrigation. And you know how pastors want to connect with the people in their community. And I just realized I was doing that far more through my business than I was through my church. And they were paying me for it, which was even better. So, yeah, business was successful. But, yeah, I've married people that I've worked for. Same guy asked me to bury his dad, But there's been some very special moments that come out of that.
Wow. So there's, I guess, a missionary lens to it. It just provides far more exposure to kind of the community around us, being in the lives of pre-Christian people. Whereas if we're honest, sometimes as Christian pastors, we can begin to live in a bit of a bubble. A lot of our life becomes about managing the church rather than necessarily being the shepherd of God's people in order to kind of see the kingdom come in our communities and our worlds.
Yeah.
And yet maybe shed some light on, I guess firstly where I'd love to take this, why would you suggest that the future is bivocational? That's a big, bold proclamation to make, of which not that I disagree. In fact, I'm wholehearted in my agreement with you. But how can we say that the future is bivocational?
Yeah, I thought, it's a much better title for a book, something provocative and controversial and, just the bivocational life. But I actually really do believe that, because I think as we look at where the church is at, as we enter a far more secular society, as we struggle for finances, and there aren't many churches out there that aren't struggling, a lot of churches are going, okay, we need to shift the way in which we do this. And we're being forced into it. We're being forced into it financially, and, the whole compliance stuff. It's just becoming a much tougher environment in which to work as pastors. But I'd want to go beyond, say, okay, maybe we are forced into it. Maybe we can look at it through a different lens and go, what an opportunity for each of our pastors to actually engage in the community in a vocational role or a paid role of some sort, where they meet the people, they engage with the very people that they want to reach. For church planners, it's gold. It really is.
Yes. Yeah, I'd agree with you wholeheartedly. And, part of my journey personally as a bivocational church planter, but also, I guess when you look at some of the prevailing characteristics of your typical church planter, there's a level of entrepreneurialism that's required. There's a level of grit and get out there and start something. I've heard lots of folk talk about in the developing world the great need for church planters to almost be business starters at the same time, because it's creating an income stream, but also you're naturally wired and gifted that way. Any insights on maybe some of those traits that are really helpful when it comes to planting?
Absolutely. Look, I think if you can start a small business that is profitable and does well, then that's ideal. Hugh Halter wrote a book called just Bivo, and then he talks
Mm.
about smart jobs and dumb jobs. And a smart job is one that pays you a good amount of money and puts you in touch with the people you want to be around, so in your
Wow.
local community. A dumb job is one that doesn't pay you much and has you locked away from people. You might have to do a dumb job. That's pretty brutal, but you might have to do that just to pay the bills.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it be ideal to have a job where you're with the people in your community and you're actually earning enough so that whether the church can afford you or not, you can still live. So we got to a point where the business paid us enough that if the church couldn't afford it, wouldn't be a problem. And in the end, we're able to sort of step out of the church, let the other guys take over, and still do our bit. We're still around the churches.
So good. So I guess what I'm hearing is that while historically this may have been a case of, as you commented before, you're not good enough to get a full-time wicket with the church or something like that. There is very much a theological and pragmatic approach to as why this might be the future going forward. Maybe
Mm.
firstly unpack some kind of theological stuff on it, like where do we see this in the New Testament, and secondly, um, I guess what are some ways that people can think more deeply about this? Maybe for those who are hearing about it for the first time. Of course, your book's a great place to start. You've just mentioned Hugh Halter's book. Maybe
Yep.
this is beginning to scratch an itch that folk maybe haven't lent into before.
Yeah, I guess I want to say to people, if you're forced into this place, then make the most of it. But what I discovered, so theologically, this was not me thinking theologically about Bi Vocational Ministry. This was me starting a small business on a whim, and then realizing that Paul was really onto something when he had his tent making business.
Mm.
And as I looked at his life and looked at how he traveled around from town to town, he had a mobile portable business. He'd kind of kick off in Corinth, hang there for a while, go to Ephesus and catch up with a couple of other tent makers. It put him in the hub of life. If you're a church planner and you can do something like that, that's beautiful.
Mm.
Theologically, I think Paul looked at it too. He kind of looked at it as he was able to support himself. He was able to raise enough money to give money away.
Mm.
So I don't think Paul was shy about making a quid. I think he was able to support himself and look after himself and support others. And look, I think there's something beautiful about doing a hard day's work and then fronting up to a church leaders meeting and being as tired as everybody else. This is the world people live in.
Yes.
I just think the fact that Jesus was a chippy for 30 years kind of goes, there's something in this understanding hard work thing.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I couldn't agree more that there is something in terms of being able to stand before a church congregation, try to inspire folk, and say, "Hey, I'm doing the same Monday to Friday, or depending upon your work arrangements. I too am
Yeah.
entering into the marketplace tomorrow when we go into our Monday." There's something quite significant about that,
Yeah.
and so I guess where I'd want to turn our attention to now is particularly like some of the, I guess, both the opportunities, like you've mentioned, the missional opportunities, you've mentioned the potential of even financial incentives because, for those who are wired that way, they may be wired to go and actually make a better source of income by doing things bivocationally. And yet, how about the challenges that you've written about and seen and experienced in the lives of bivocational leaders? The challenges of sometimes being in two headspaces and the juggle of all that.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's some things you need to work out, like whether you're going to live separate, have your job separate, or whether they're going to be to some degree integrated. So, for example, what I did was I would work for the church on Monday and Friday, and obviously Sunday, and I'd run my business Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. But we lived a very integrated type of experience where, if I had to do a job on Monday, I would. If I had to write a sermon on Wednesday, I would. So we went the integrated approach. Some people need to keep them separate. I think the whole thing of expectations is really big. The expectations of the church leaders, of the church even, because everyone's got expectations. There's your own expectations of yourself, your wife's expectations. I would say to people, make sure you're on the same page broadly. What I said to our church when we started up, I said, I can work 2 days a week. I'm good at teaching, leading, and meeting with blokes. I can do those things well. After that, if it gets done, it gets done. Not big on admin, not big on compliance, but hopefully someone is. Because it ain't going to be me. Unfortunately, my wife was that person who kept on poking me in the back and saying you need to write a risk assessment for this, and
Yeah, wow.
yeah.
Yeah.
So expectations are big. Other challenges, I think it'd be a real challenge to be in a really crappy job. Honestly, I think that's hard. I've been really blessed. So being a phys ed teacher was great. I was a phys ed teacher in the same suburb. The school was in the same suburb as a church in which I was a youth pastor.
Wow.
So, I mean, it had challenges. I'd be teaching the Year 9 boys health education period 8 Friday, and then 30 of them would rock up to the youth ministry on Friday night and we serve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great.
But yeah.
Well, it's very good. I totally agree. And the more and more I kind of see and experience different leaders across the Aussie church, those who maybe struggle more with having multiple headspaces and the kind of conflicting nature of like one day I'm in this space, let alone maybe the next hour I'm in the next space. And the fluidness of that can be a very real challenge. Andrew, I'm wondering, particularly as we begin to kind of draw our conversation to a close, like what are some of the things that you'd want to encourage folk in when it comes to the future being bivocational? Like any sense of encouragement that you've seen and experienced? Give us some insights maybe from obviously the book that you've written. How can some folk begin to think more deeply about this, not just as a forced alternative, but potentially as an opportunity for our churches in the way that we mobilize people towards mission?
Yeah, I guess the core of making this thing work for me was a deep sense of vocation to be a missionary, but to be a missionary to Australia. So whether I was, whatever I was doing, there's this core identity of being a missionary. I feel like that's a big thing for us in a secular culture to be able to say, this is what we need to be about. Some of us are probably more gifted that way than others. So the apostolic types and the evangelistic types will find that easier than the pastoral types. But I feel like it's there for all of us to do in different ways. So if you're a pastor, you engage. My wife's very pastoral; she engages in a different way with the folks around us than I do. But still, it's really valuable. So, what am I saying? Going forward, if you know your identity, if you're clear that there is a missionary task and that can adapt itself to whichever of the fivefold ministries you represent, then you can enter your world just with that as like an underlying sense of identity that just guides everything you do. So for me, that's it. When we're down the cafe this morning, there's people I meet who I know from work, who I know from walking the dog even, and it just guides everything we do. So, I hope going forward that we can take this B grade tag off being bivocational.
Totally.
And those pastors who are out there planting churches and working hard, I really hope you can value what you do as much of the calling of God as your pastoral ministry role in the church.
Yeah, I can't remember who said it, but the quote that kind of comes to mind is, where the needs of this world and your passions converge, that is your vocation. And just kind of, I think we get wonderful opportunities as each of us vocationally seek to advance the kingdom in Australia. And those who are going to plant churches, those who are going to serve on church planting teams, those who are going to release entrepreneurs and creatives and all sorts of different things into the world in order to advance the kingdom. Just that deepening sense of a vocational call and yet a recognition that we are all called to build God's church in whatever capacity that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really feel this is one of those things for church planners that if we can get away from it being the second grade option to seeing it as the opportunity that God's put in front of us. And look, I know some of you are probably out there working jobs that you don't enjoy. I encourage you to stick with it, and hopefully something in your local neighbourhood that pays you a good amount will come up. And the money's not even that critical, I suppose. But, I've thought about serving coffees down at the local cafe just because you see all those people,
I think they call it the modern day counsellor, don't they? Andrew, the barista. Anyway, so to finish off our time, of course, you've released your book, The Future is Vocational, Bivocational, beg your pardon. You've mentioned the Hugh Halter resource. Anywhere else that you'd point folk who are particularly beginning to think this way or recognise there are some opportunities in this space?
Yeah, look, Brad Briscoe is a guy in the US who's written a great book. I forget what it's called now, but his is it's a higher level thinking through the theological implications of being bivocational. But so if you Google Brad Briscoe, he comes up. But Brad, Hugh, and they're probably the only two other guys that I kind of go, they've written significantly on. But their stuff's really good.
So good. Well, Andrew, we so appreciate your time today, both in terms of
Thank you.
your passion, what you've written about, obviously your heart for the Lord and ministry, but as we started our conversation off today by sharing a very deep and vulnerable part of your more recent journey. And so for that, we're really thankful, and we just want to honour the man that you are and the journey that you're walking through at this time. So thanks for sharing with us today.
Thanks, Charlie. Really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to folks on here. Go well, you guys.